In the quiet marshlands of southwestern Spain, where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic Ocean in a gentle embrace of salt and fresh water, ancient secrets lie buried beneath layers of silt and thyme. The wind whispers through the wetlands of Doñana, carrying with it echoes of a civilization so remarkable, so advanced, and so mysteriously vanished that for centuries the greatest scholars of Europe wondered if it had ever truly existed at all. These are not barren lands. Walk through this landscape today, and you will find yourself surrounded by a tapestry of life that seems almost primordial in its richness. Flamingos wade through shallow waters, their pink reflections shimmering like scattered rose petals on the surface. Wild horses roam freely across ancient dunes, their hoofbeats perhaps following paths first carved by Bronze Age travelers. Eagles soar overhead, casting shadows that dance across marshes where, thousands of years ago, merchant ships once anchored to trade gold and silver with mysterious kings. But beneath this natural beauty lies something even more extraordinary. For this is the land where Europe's first great civilization may have flourished, a place where writing was practiced when much of the continent still lived in pre-literate darkness, where sophisticated metalworking techniques produced jewelry so exquisite that Greek traders sailed beyond the known world to acquire it. History remembers the great empires with clarity and certainty. We know of Rome with its legions marching across cobblestone roads that still bear traffic today. We recall Babylon with its hanging gardens and towering ziggurats that scraped the ancient sky. Egypt speaks to us through its pyramids and golden treasures, through hieroglyphs that tell stories of pharaohs and gods. These civilizations left behind monuments so massive, so enduring that forgetting them would be impossible. But some civilizations vanish so completely that even their names sound like fairy tales, like distant dreams half remembered upon waking. Their stones are scattered, their cities buried, their very existence questioned by those who come after. Yet sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, if we dig patiently enough, these lost worlds speak to us again. One such culture was Tartessos, a name that rolls off the tongue like ancient poetry, yet carries the weight of genuine historical mystery. The very sound of it evokes images of distant shores and forgotten kingdoms, of ships heavy with precious cargo sailing into sunset horizons. The ancient Greeks wrote of this place with a mixture of wonder and respect that seems almost breathless in its enthusiasm. They described it as a land of unimaginable wealth, where rivers ran thick with precious metals and kings reigned for lifetimes that seemed to stretch beyond mortal years. These were not simple barbarians, the Greeks insisted. The people of Tartessos were civilized, sophisticated, wise. They spoke of rulers who welcomed foreign visitors with open arms and generous hospitality, of craftsmen who worked gold and silver with skills that dazzled Mediterranean traders accustomed to the finest artisans of their own lands. They wrote of a people who had learned the art of writing when much of Europe still depended on oral tradition alone, who had developed legal systems and religious practices that impressed visitors from the most advanced cultures of their time. The Greek accounts paint a picture that seems almost utopian in its perfection. Here was a kingdom where wisdom flourished alongside wealth, where foreign merchants were treated as honored guests rather than potential enemies, where the arts of peace were valued as highly as the skills of war. King Arganthonios, they wrote, reigned for 80 years and lived to be 120, welcoming Greek colonists and sharing his people's knowledge freely with visitors from distant lands. For generations upon generations, these accounts seemed too fantastic to believe. Tartessos appeared in classical texts like a mirage, shimmering between reality and legend, tantalizing scholars with glimpses of something extraordinary that might or might not have ever existed. The descriptions were so glowing, so filled with wonder, that many assumed the Greeks had simply invented this golden kingdom, perhaps conflating distant rumors with wishful thinking about lands beyond the edge of their known world. After all, the Greeks were storytellers as much as historians. They gave us the tales of Atlantis, of the Golden Fleece, of cities where the streets were paved with precious metals. How could serious scholars distinguish between myth and reality when the accounts sounded so much like the fantasies that filled ancient literature? And so Tartessos became a footnote in history books, mentioned briefly as a possible inspiration for later legends, dismissed as either completely fictional or so thoroughly mythologized that recovering any historical truth seemed impossible. For centuries, the name survived only in the works of classical authors, like a pressed flower between the pages of ancient books, beautiful but lifeless. But beneath the Spanish soil, truth waited patiently, in the darkness of buried ruins, in the silence of forgotten temples, in the depths of abandoned mines. Evidence accumulated like sediment, layer by layer, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to those who knew how to look. That moment came in the 20th century when archaeologists armed with new techniques and guided by fresh perspectives began to excavate sites across southern Spain. What they found changed everything. In museum cases today, golden jewelry gleams under soft lights, each piece a testament to ancient hands that shaped beauty from precious metal with techniques that rival modern craftsmanship. Stone inscriptions bear witness to a script older than Rome, carved by people who had something important to say to the future and the skill to say it in lasting stone. Archaeological sites dot the Andalusian landscape like breadcrumbs on a trail leading back through millennia. At Cerro del Carambolo near Seville, excavators uncovered a treasure trove of golden ornaments so sophisticated that they rewrote textbooks about prehistoric Iberian culture. At Cancho Roano in the province of Badajoz, the remains of a ritual complex revealed architectural knowledge and religious practices that spoke of a highly organized society. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle that had seemed unsolvable. Pottery fragments showed trade connections stretching across the Mediterranean. Metal ingots bore the marks of advanced smelting techniques. Burial goods revealed social hierarchies and religious beliefs that grew more complex with each new excavation. The story of Tartessos became the story of discovery itself, of how patient excavation and careful scholarship can resurrect entire worlds from the dust of ages. It reminded archaeologists and historians that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that sometimes the most profound truths lie not in the grand monuments that dominate textbooks, but in the quiet places where forgotten peoples once called home. More than that, it became a reminder of how much we still do not know about our own past. If an entire civilization could hide beneath Spanish marshlands for thousands of years, what other wonders might be waiting beneath our feet? What other stories are the stones trying to tell us, if only we have the patience to listen? As we journey together into this ancient mystery, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the documented past and the whispered possibilities that archaeology continues to uncover. This is the story of Tartessos, Spain's forgotten civilization, and perhaps if we listen carefully to what the evidence tells us, Europe's first great kingdom. It is a story that reminds us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation between past and present, between the voices of the dead and the curiosity of the living. The first whispers of Tartessos reach us through the voices of ancient Greek writers, men who lived when the Mediterranean was a smaller world, when every voyage beyond familiar shores was an adventure into the unknown. These were scholars and travelers who collected stories like precious gems, recording tales heard in bustling port cities where merchants from distant lands gathered to trade not just goods, but knowledge itself. In the smoky taverns of Rhodes and the marble porticos of Athens, these stories would have been told and retold, each telling perhaps adding new details or polishing away rough edges until the accounts took on the smooth perfection of well-worn stones. Yet beneath the layers of retelling, something authentic seems to shine through, something that speaks of real places and real people whose lives unfolded in ways that captured the imagination of the ancient world. Among these voices, none speaks more clearly about Tartessos than Herodotus, the man later generations would call the father of history. Writing in the 5th century before Christ, when the Persian Wars were still fresh in Greek memory and the golden age of Athens was reaching its zenith, Herodotus possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond Greece. He was a man who believed that every corner of the earth held wonders worth recording, that the customs and achievements of distant peoples deserved to be preserved for future generations. Herodotus traveled extensively throughout his lifetime, journeying to Egypt to study the ancient pyramids, visiting Babylon to observe its hanging gardens, sailing to the Black Sea colonies to interview merchants who traded with the mysterious Scythians. He was a collector of human experience, a man who understood that the world was far larger and more diverse than most of his contemporaries imagined. His approach to gathering information was systematic and thorough. He would seek out multiple sources for each story, comparing accounts from different witnesses, always trying to separate reliable testimony from mere hearsay. When Herodotus wrote about Tartessos, his tone carried a special quality of wonder that distinguished it from his descriptions of other distant lands. This was not merely another barbarian kingdom on the edges of civilization, he seemed to suggest, but something genuinely remarkable, something that challenged Greek assumptions about what lay beyond the boundaries of their known world. He told the story of Calais, a Greek merchant from the island of Samos who, around 630 years before Christ, found himself embarking on what should have been a routine trading voyage to Egypt. These were dangerous times for Mediterranean commerce. Pirates prowled the sea lanes, storms could drive ships far off course, and political tensions between the various Greek city-states made even familiar routes potentially hazardous. Calais and his crew encountered just such difficulties. Driven off course by contrary winds that seemed determined to push them away from their intended destination, they found themselves sailing westward through waters that grew increasingly unfamiliar. Day after day, they watched the sun set ahead of their bow, carrying them further and further from the world they knew. Eventually, their wandering brought them to the Pillars of Hercules, the great rocks that stood like sentinels at the western edge of the Mediterranean. Beyond these pillars lay the vast Atlantic Ocean, a body of water so mysterious and feared that most Greeks believed it to be the realm of monsters and gods. Few mortals dared to venture into those limitless waters, and fewer still returned to tell of what they had seen. But Calais, whether driven by desperation or curiosity, sailed through the straits and into the Atlantic. What he discovered there would become the stuff of legend. Instead of the monsters and eternal darkness that Greek sailors feared, he found a coastline rich with harbors and river mouths, a land that seemed to welcome visitors rather than threaten them. More importantly, he encountered people. These were not the savage tribes that Greeks expected to find at the edges of the world, but a sophisticated civilization ruled by a king whose very name seemed to speak of silver and precious metals. This monarch, called Arganthonios, would become one of the most famous figures in ancient accounts of the Far West. King Arganthonios, Herodotus wrote, lived to the extraordinary age of 120 years and reigned for 80 of them, a lifespan that seemed almost mythical to Greeks accustomed to the brief, violent careers of their own rulers. In a world where most people considered themselves fortunate to reach 50, where kings typically died young in battle or fell victim to palace conspiracies, the idea of a monarch who ruled peacefully for 8 decades seemed to belong more to the realm of legend than history. Yet Herodotus presented this information as verified fact, supported by testimony from multiple sources who had either visited Tartessos themselves or heard accounts from reliable witnesses. The longevity of Arganthonios was not presented as supernatural or divine, but as a natural consequence of living in a land blessed with favorable conditions and wise governance. But it was not just the king's remarkable lifespan that impressed the Greek visitors. Arganthonios welcomed them with a hospitality that went far beyond mere politeness or diplomatic courtesy. In a world where foreigners were often viewed with suspicion or treated as potential threats, the Tartessian king embraced his unexpected guests with genuine warmth and generosity. He invited them to settle permanently in his lands, offering them homes and citizenship in a kingdom where, the Greeks soon discovered, wealth flowed like water from natural springs. This was not the desperate attempt of a weak ruler to attract foreign settlers for military protection, but the confident gesture of a monarch secure in his power and genuinely interested in the knowledge and skills that foreigners might bring to his realm. The Greeks found themselves in a land where the very rivers carried flakes of precious metal in their currents, where farmers plowing their fields would turn up nuggets of silver mixed with ordinary soil, where the mountains held veins of ore so pure and accessible that mining required little more than the simplest tools. This was wealth on a scale that dazzled visitors from civilizations that considered themselves the height of sophistication and prosperity. When Calais and his men eventually chose to return to their native Samos, perhaps homesick for familiar shores or eager to share news of their discovery with the Greek world, King Arganthonios loaded their ships with so much silver that their cargo was worth 60 talents, a fortune so vast it could fund the construction of temples, the maintenance of armies, or the founding of new colonies. To put this sum in perspective, a single talent represented the wages that a skilled craftsman might earn in 9 years of steady work. 60 talents was enough to purchase a fleet of warships or to hire a mercenary army for an entire campaign season. It was the kind of wealth that transformed cities and altered the balance of power between rival states. The account reads like a fairy tale, yet Herodotus presented it as sober historical fact, supported by evidence that his contemporaries could verify. The silver brought back by Callias was real enough, its purity and craftsmanship unlike anything produced in the Greek world. The wealth it represented transformed Samos into one of the most prosperous islands in the Aegean, funding architectural projects and artistic achievements that would be remembered for centuries. The famous Heraion of Samos, one of the largest temples in the ancient world, was built partly with Tartessian silver. Its massive columns and elaborate sculptures stood as permanent monuments to the generosity of a king who lived at the edge of the known world. Every Greek who walked through its sacred precincts was walking through a building made possible by the wealth of Tartessos. Other Greek writers added their own layers to this growing portrait of the mysterious Western kingdom. Strabo, the great geographer who lived during the time of Augustus Caesar, had access to sources that have since been lost to us, including earlier works by explorers and merchants whose accounts have vanished into the darkness of time. Drawing upon these multiple traditions, he wove together a more detailed and comprehensive picture of Tartessian civilization. In his monumental work, Geography, Strabo described Tartessos not as a single city, but as an entire region, a land blessed with natural resources so abundant that it seemed almost supernatural in its richness. According to his sources, the very landscape of Tartessos seemed designed by the gods to produce wealth. The mountains held not just silver, but also copper, tin, and gold. The rivers carried these metals down from the highlands, depositing them in easily accessible places where human ingenuity could transform raw ore into objects of beauty and utility. But Strabo also provided hints of something deeper than mere material abundance. The Tartessians, he suggested, were not simply fortunate in their geography. They had developed a civilization that knew how to make sophisticated use of their natural advantages. They had laws and customs that governed their society with wisdom and justice. They had religious practices that connected them to the divine forces they believed controlled their prosperity. They had artistic traditions that transformed precious metals into objects of stunning beauty. Most remarkably, according to Strabo, they had learned the art of writing, creating inscriptions in a script that was uniquely their own. This detail, if accurate, would have made Tartessos extraordinary among the peoples of ancient Western Europe, most of whom depended entirely on oral tradition to preserve their histories and cultural knowledge. Strabo went even further, claiming that the Tartessians possessed historical records of their own, written documents that recorded their past with a precision that stretched back thousands of years. If true, this would have made them not just literate, but genuinely historical in their thinking, a people who understood that the past was worth preserving and that future generations might benefit from the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. The implications were staggering. Here was a civilization that not only knew how to write, but had been doing so long enough to accumulate a substantial written heritage. In an age when most European peoples measured time by the reigns of kings or the cycles of seasons, the Tartessians apparently possessed chronicles that recorded events across millennia. Another voice from antiquity adds yet more fascinating detail to our picture of this lost civilization. Aviennius, a Roman writer of the 4th century after Christ, had access to even earlier sources than Strabo, including a lost navigational work called the Massaliote Periplus. This ancient sailing manual, compiled by Greek explorers from the colony of Massalia, modern Marseille, dated back to the 6th century before Christ, making it one of the earliest systematic accounts of the Western Mediterranean. In his poem Aura Maritima, which translates as The Maritime Shore, Aviennius used these ancient sources to recreate a detailed picture of the Spanish coastline as it existed nearly 1,000 years before his own time. His account is particularly valuable because it describes Tartessos during what may have been the height of its power and influence, before the political changes and environmental shifts that would eventually lead to its decline. Through the eyes of Aviennius and his ancient sources, we glimpse Tartessos as a land of islands and estuaries, of complex waterways where fresh and salt water mingled in patterns that created unique ecosystems. The geography he describes is almost Venice-like in its complexity, a network of channels and lagoons that provided natural highways for commerce and communication. The Tartessians, according to these ancient navigational accounts, had developed a sophisticated understanding of these waterways that allowed them to move goods and people across their territory with remarkable efficiency. They knew the patterns of tides and currents, the seasonal variations in water levels, the safest routes through treacherous shallows. This knowledge made them masters of their own environment and gave them significant advantages in trade and transportation. These Greek and Roman sources, when taken together, paint a picture of Tartessos that is both tantalizingly detailed and maddeningly incomplete. We learn of specific kings and particular events, of trade relationships and cultural practices, yet the overall image remains somehow elusive, like a photograph slightly out of focus. The details are there, but they refuse to coalesce into a complete and coherent picture. What emerges most clearly from these ancient testimonies is that the Greeks consistently portrayed the Tartessians as civilized people, sophisticated in their customs, and generous in their treatment of foreigners. This was not the usual way that Mediterranean writers described the peoples they encountered beyond the boundaries of their own cultural sphere. Barbarians were typically depicted as crude and violent, interesting perhaps for their exotic customs but clearly inferior to Greek civilization in every meaningful way. Tartessos was different. The Greeks wrote about it with respect, even admiration. They described its rulers as wise and just, its people as skilled and prosperous. They spoke of it as a place where the arts flourished alongside commerce, where foreign visitors were welcomed rather than feared or exploited, where wealth was used not just for display but for the genuine improvement of human life. To understand how an entire civilization could vanish so completely that scholars would question its very existence, we must first understand the land itself, the geography that both nurtured Tartessos and ultimately helped to hide it from the world. This is a story written in rivers and marshes, in shifting sands and rising waters, in the slow but relentless forces that reshape coastlines over the course of millennia. The region that the ancient Greeks knew as Tartessos lies in what we now call Andalusia, in the southwestern corner of Spain, where the Iberian Peninsula reaches toward Africa across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. This is a landscape of extraordinary contrasts, where snow-capped mountains give way to rolling hills, where fertile river valleys open onto coastal plains, where the inland climate of continental Europe meets the maritime influences of both the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. At the heart of this region flows the Guadalquivir River, whose very name echoes with the sound of flowing water. The Arabs who conquered this land in the 8th century after Christ called it Wadi al-Kabir, meaning the Great River, and indeed it is the greatest river of southern Spain. For hundreds of miles, it winds its way from the mountains of eastern Andalusia to the Atlantic coast, gathering tributaries along the way, carrying with it not just water but the accumulated wealth of the entire region. In ancient times, this river was even more important than it is today. Before modern dams and irrigation systems altered its flow, before centuries of deforestation changed the patterns of rainfall and runoff, the Guadalquivir carried far more water than it does now. It was navigable much further inland, allowing ocean-going vessels to sail deep into the heart of Iberia, bringing traders and their goods to settlements that today seem impossibly far from the sea. But it was not just the volume of water that made this river special. The Guadalquivir and its tributaries drained a region extraordinarily rich in mineral resources. The mountains that fed these streams contained some of the richest deposits of copper, silver, and tin in the ancient world. As water carved its way through these metalliferous rocks, it carried with it tiny particles of precious metals, depositing them in the river gravels where they could be collected by anyone with the knowledge and patience to separate metal from stone. This was placer mining on a vast scale, a natural process that concentrated the wealth of entire mountain ranges into easily accessible river deposits. The ancient sources speak of Tartessian rivers that ran silver, and while this may have been poetic exaggeration, it contained a kernel of literal truth. These waters did carry precious metals, enough to support a civilization based on metalworking and trade. The mouth of the Guadalquivir, where the river meets the Atlantic Ocean, was in ancient times a very different place than it is today. Instead of the relatively simple estuary we see now, the coast was characterized by a complex system of islands, lagoons, and marshes that created one of the richest ecosystems in Europe. This was a landscape that seemed designed by nature to support both wildlife and human civilization. Imagine standing on this ancient coastline 3,000 years ago. Before you would stretch a vast wetland, a maze of waterways where fresh and salt water mingled in constantly changing patterns. Islands of higher ground, some large enough to support substantial settlements, rose from this watery landscape like green jewels scattered across blue silk. Between them, channels wound in serpentine curves, some deep enough for large ships, others suitable only for the shallow draft vessels that local people used for fishing and local transport. This was an environment that provided everything a Bronze Age or Iron Age civilization could need. The waters teemed with fish that could be caught year-round. The marshes supported vast flocks of waterfowl that migrated along ancient flyways stretching from northern Europe to Africa. Salt could be harvested from evaporation ponds. Reed beds provided material for construction and basketry. The higher ground was fertile and well-watered, perfect for agriculture. But perhaps most importantly, from the perspective of an emerging civilization, this landscape provided security. The complex waterways created natural barriers that made invasion difficult while facilitating trade and communication for those who knew how to navigate them. A people who mastered this environment would have significant advantages over any enemies who might threaten them from land or sea. The Tartessians, according to the ancient sources, did indeed master this environment. They developed a sophisticated understanding of the tides and currents that governed their watery world. They learned to use the seasonal floods that brought both fresh water and fertile silt to their agricultural lands. They created a network of settlements connected by waterways that served as natural highways for commerce and communication. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Tartessians also understood how to manage their environment in ways that enhanced its natural productivity. They built systems of channels and dikes that controlled flooding and extended the area of arable land. They developed techniques for salt production that may have supplied markets throughout the Western Mediterranean. They created fish traps and weirs that allowed them to harvest the bounty of their rivers and coastal waters on a sustainable basis. This was environmental engineering on a scale that would not be seen again in this region until the modern era. The Tartessians were not simply adapting to their landscape, they were actively shaping it to serve their needs, creating what may have been one of the first examples of large-scale landscape management in European history. But landscapes are not static. The same forces that created this rich environment were constantly at work changing it. Rivers carry not just water, but sediment. Millions of tons of soil and rock eroded from the mountains and hills of their watersheds. Over time, this sediment builds up in river mouths and coastal areas, gradually filling in harbors and pushing the shoreline outward. The process is normally slow, taking place over centuries or millennia, but occasionally dramatic events can accelerate these changes. Earthquakes can alter the course of rivers or cause massive landslides that dump enormous quantities of sediment into waterways. Severe storms can reshape coastlines in a matter of days. Climate changes can alter rainfall patterns, affecting both the volume of water rivers carry and the amount of sediment they transport. All of these factors seem to have played a role in the transformation of the Tartessian landscape. Geological evidence suggests that the region experienced significant seismic activity during the first millennium before Christ. The famous Lisbon earthquake of 1755 after Christ, which was felt throughout southwestern Iberia, was part of a pattern of tectonic activity that has affected this region throughout recorded history. Such earthquakes could have had devastating effects on a civilization dependent on rivers and harbors for its prosperity. A major seismic event might block river channels with landslides, alter the course of waterways, or cause coastal areas to sink below sea level. Any of these changes could disrupt the delicate balance between human activity and natural environment that seems to have characterized Tartessian civilization. Climate change also played a role in the transformation of this landscape. The period from roughly 1,000 to 500 years before Christ was characterized by increasing aridity in much of the Mediterranean region. Forests that had covered the mountains of southern Spain for millennia began to thin out, replaced by the scrubland vegetation that characterizes much of the region today. This deforestation had profound effects on the river systems that fed the Tartessian heartland. Trees and their root systems normally hold soil in place, preventing erosion during heavy rains. As the forests disappeared, more and more soil was washed into the rivers during storm events. The increased sediment load caused rivers to change course more frequently and filled in the harbors and channels that were essential to Tartessian commerce. The process was gradual but inexorable. Over the course of several centuries, the complex system of waterways that had supported Tartessian civilization slowly filled with silt. Islands became part of the mainland. Deep harbors became shallow lagoons, then dry land. The navigable channels that had carried trade goods into the heart of Iberia became too shallow for ocean-going vessels. Modern scientific techniques have allowed researchers to trace this process with remarkable precision. Core samples taken from the sediments of the Guadalquivir Delta reveal layer upon layer of riverborne soil, each stratum telling part of the story of environmental change. Pollen analysis shows how vegetation patterns changed over time, reflecting both climate change and human activities like deforestation and agriculture. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed the outlines of ancient river channels buried beneath meters of accumulated sediment. These ghostly waterways, invisible from the ground but clearly visible from space, show us the landscape as it existed when Tartessos flourished. They reveal a coast indented with deep bays and estuaries crossed by multiple river channels, dotted with islands that provided secure locations for settlements and harbors. The comparison between ancient and modern geography is striking. Where the Tartessians knew a landscape of islands and deep water channels, we see solid ground covered with farms and modern towns. Where ancient ships once anchored in protected harbors, cattle now graze in pastures dozens of kilometers from the sea. The very land that supported one of Europe's first great civilizations lies buried beneath its own transformed geography. This environmental transformation helps explain one of the great puzzles of Tartessian archaeology: why so few traces of this apparently wealthy and sophisticated civilization have been found. Unlike the civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, which built their cities on stable river terraces or desert margins, the Tartessians built their settlements in an environment that was constantly changing. Their cities and harbors were gradually buried by the same natural processes that had originally made their land so fertile and productive. The irony is profound. The geographic features that made Tartessos wealthy and powerful ultimately contributed to its disappearance from history. The rivers that brought trade goods and precious metals also brought the silt that would bury its harbors. The marshes that provided food and security also preserved organic materials that might otherwise have decayed, but they did so beneath layers of sediment that made archaeological investigation difficult or impossible. Today, much of the ancient Tartessian heartland lies within the boundaries of Doñana National Park, one of Europe's most important wetland reserves. The same environmental richness that attracted the Tartessians 3,000 years ago continues to support an extraordinary diversity of wildlife. Flamingos wade through waters that may once have reflected the sails of Phoenician trading ships. Wild horses gallop across dunes that may cover the ruins of ancient cities. The park's protected status means that large-scale archaeological excavation is impossible, leaving the most promising sites for future investigation tantalizingly out of reach. Remote sensing techniques can reveal the outlines of buried structures, but confirming their age and cultural identity requires the kind of extensive excavation that environmental protection regulations do not permit. This creates a unique situation in archaeology, a lost civilization whose remains are almost certainly preserved beneath our feet, but which must remain buried to protect the natural environment that succeeded it. The very success of conservation efforts in this region means that some of Tartessos may remain forever hidden, a buried treasure that we can detect but not fully recover. Yet this geographic transformation also offers hope for future discovery. The same sediments that buried Tartessian sites have also preserved them, protecting organic materials and delicate artifacts that might otherwise have been destroyed by exposure to air and weather. When new technologies eventually allow non-invasive investigation of these buried landscapes, they may reveal a civilization preserved in remarkable detail, a Bronze Age Pompeii waiting beneath the marshes of Andalusia. The geography of Tartessos thus becomes part of its mystery. The land that created this civilization also hid it, transforming a complex waterscape into solid ground, burying harbors and cities beneath fertile fields and protected wetlands. Understanding this transformation is essential to understanding why Tartessos seemed to vanish from history and why rediscovering it has proven to be such a challenging task for modern archaeology. In the summer of 1958, workers laying the foundation for a sports club on a low hill called Cerro del Carambolo, just outside the ancient city of Seville, made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of prehistoric Spain. As their shovels bit into the red earth of the hillside, they struck something that glinted in the Andalusian sunlight. What they had found was not merely treasure in the conventional sense, but evidence of a civilization that most scholars had dismissed as legend. The Carambolo treasure, as it came to be known, consisted of 21 pieces of exquisitely crafted golden jewelry, each one a masterpiece of ancient metalworking that revealed skills and artistic sensibilities far more sophisticated than anyone had expected to find in Bronze Age Iberia. These were not crude trinkets hammered out by primitive craftsmen, but works of art that could hold their own beside the finest productions of contemporary Greek or Phoenician workshops. The largest pieces were pectorals, ornamental breastplates designed to be worn by individuals of the highest status. Each one was covered with intricate patterns of rosettes, palmettes, and geometric designs that spoke of a highly developed artistic tradition. The goldwork showed influences from across the Mediterranean world, yet it was distinctly different from anything found elsewhere, representing a unique synthesis of foreign techniques with local aesthetic preferences. But it was not just the beauty of these objects that excited archaeologists, it was what they represented about the society that had created them. Gold jewelry of this quality required not just skilled craftsmen, but an entire economic and social system capable of supporting specialized artisans. It implied the existence of wealthy patrons who could commission such works, of trade networks that could supply both raw materials and artistic influences, of political stability sufficient to allow luxury crafts to flourish. The dating of the Carambolo treasure placed it firmly in the 7th to 6th centuries before Christ, exactly the period when the ancient sources suggested that Tartessos was at the height of its power and influence. Here, at last, was physical evidence that corroborated the literary accounts of a wealthy and sophisticated civilization in southwestern Spain. But the treasure was only the beginning of what Cerro del Carambolo would reveal. Subsequent excavations uncovered the remains of a substantial building complex that appeared to have served religious purposes. The architecture showed clear Phoenician influences, with techniques and design elements that connected this site to the broader world of Mediterranean civilization. The building itself was constructed around a central courtyard, with rooms arranged in a pattern that archaeologists recognized from Phoenician sites throughout the Western Mediterranean. The walls were built of carefully fitted stone blocks, showing a level of engineering skill that required both knowledge and experience. The floor plans suggested spaces designed for ritual activities, with areas that may have been used for sacred meals or ceremonial gatherings. Most intriguingly, the site showed evidence of having been deliberately buried at some point in its history. Rather than being abandoned and left to decay naturally, the building had been carefully covered with earth and stones, as if its final occupants had wanted to preserve it for future generations or to hide it from enemies. This deliberate burial may explain why the site survived with its treasures intact while other Tartessian settlements disappeared without a trace. The discovery at Cerro del Carambolo opened the floodgates for Tartessian archaeology. Across southwestern Spain, archaeologists began to recognize sites and artifacts that had previously been misunderstood or overlooked. What emerged was a picture of a culture that was far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. At Cancho Roano, in the province of Badajoz, excavations revealed one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in Iberia. This was a monumental complex built in the 5th century before Christ, consisting of a central building surrounded by a massive wall that enclosed an area of several hectares. The main structure was unlike anything else known from prehistoric Spain, with a design that seemed to combine elements from various Mediterranean architectural traditions. The building at Cancho Roano was clearly designed for ceremonial purposes. Its central hall could accommodate large gatherings, while smaller rooms around the perimeter may have served as storage areas for ritual equipment or as private spaces for religious officials. The quality of construction was exceptional, with walls built of carefully dressed stone blocks and floors paved with precisely fitted flagstones. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of Cancho Roano was the evidence it provided for the ritual practices of its builders. The site contained numerous altars and offering pits, many of which still held the remains of sacrificial animals and votive offerings. These included not just local products but imported items from across the Mediterranean, suggesting that this remote site was connected to trade networks that spanned the ancient world. The pottery found at Cancho Roano was particularly revealing. Alongside local Tartessian ceramics, archaeologists found Greek-painted vessels, Phoenician amphorae, and even pieces that may have come from as far away as Egypt or the Black Sea. This was not the material culture of an isolated barbarian tribe, but of a society that was fully integrated into the broader Mediterranean world. The site also yielded evidence of literacy in the form of inscribed stones bearing Tartessian script. These inscriptions, though still not fully deciphered, represent some of the earliest writing in Western Europe. The very fact that the Tartessians were creating permanent inscriptions suggests a level of social complexity that required record-keeping and formal communication. Like Cerro del Carambolo, Cancho Roano showed evidence of deliberate destruction and burial. The site had been systematically dismantled and covered with earth, but not before its most valuable contents had been carefully removed. This pattern of deliberate termination appears at multiple Tartessian sites, suggesting that the end of this civilization was not a sudden catastrophe, but a planned withdrawal or transformation. At Setafilla near Seville, excavations uncovered a cemetery that provided invaluable insights into Tartessian society and beliefs. The burial ground was used for several centuries, from the 8th to the 5th centuries before Christ, allowing archaeologists to trace changes in burial practices and social organization over time. The earliest burials at Setafilla were cremations, with the ashes of the dead placed in ceramic urns and buried with grave goods that reflected their status in life. These early graves contained locally made pottery and bronze objects, suggesting a society that was prosperous but still primarily regional in its connections. As time progressed, the graves became richer and more elaborate. Later burials contained imported ceramics from Greece and Phoenicia, bronze vessels of exceptional quality, and even items made of ivory and precious metals. Some graves contained weapons and horse equipment, suggesting that warfare and horsemanship played important roles in Tartessian society. The most elaborate burial at Setafilla was that of a young woman who had been interred with a remarkable collection of grave goods. Her burial included Greek pottery, Phoenician jewelry, and a bronze mirror that showed influences from both Eastern and Western Mediterranean artistic traditions. The richness of her grave goods suggested that women could hold positions of high status in Tartessian society, a finding that challenged assumptions about gender roles in prehistoric Europe. The burial practices revealed at Setafilla also provided evidence for Tartessian religious beliefs. Many graves contained offerings of food and drink, suggesting belief in an afterlife where the dead would need sustenance. Some burials included small bronze figurines that may have represented deities or protective spirits. The orientation of graves and the positioning of grave goods followed consistent patterns that spoke of well-established ritual traditions. At Huelva, on the Atlantic coast, marine archaeologists made discoveries that revealed the maritime aspects of Tartessian civilization. The waters off this ancient port city have yielded one of the largest collections of Bronze Age metalwork ever found in Europe. Hundreds of bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments have been recovered from what appears to have been either a shipwreck or a deliberate deposit of valuable objects. The Huelva Hoard, as this collection is known, includes objects from across Western Europe and beyond. There are swords and spearheads in styles characteristic of the Atlantic Bronze Age, axes and chisels that show connections to Central European metalworking traditions, and ornamental objects that reflect influences from the Eastern Mediterranean. This remarkable assemblage suggests that Huelva was a major center of international trade, a place where merchants from many different cultures came to exchange goods and ideas. The variety of objects in the Huelva hoard also provides evidence for the sophistication of Tartessian metallurgy. Chemical analysis of the bronze objects reveals that Tartessian metalworkers had access to tin sources from across Europe and understood complex alloy compositions that produced bronze of exceptional quality. Some objects show evidence of having been repaired or modified, suggesting that they were valued possessions that were maintained and used over long periods. Perhaps most remarkably, the Huelva hoard includes several objects that appear to be unique to the Tartessian cultural area. These include distinctive types of brooches and belt buckles that have been found at other Tartessian sites but nowhere else in Europe. The presence of these distinctively local products alongside international imports suggests that Tartessian craftsmen were not merely copying foreign styles, but were developing their own artistic traditions. At Casas del Turuñuelo in the province of Badajoz, recent excavations have uncovered what may be the best preserved Tartessian site yet discovered. This remarkable complex, dating to the 5th century before Christ, was preserved by the same process of deliberate burial that protected Cerro del Carambolo and Cancho Roano. The main building at Casas del Turuñuelo is a two-story structure built around a central courtyard, with walls constructed of carefully fitted stone blocks and floors paved with precisely cut flagstones. The quality of construction rivals that of contemporary buildings in the Greek or Roman world, demonstrating that Tartessian architects and engineers possessed skills equal to those of their Mediterranean neighbors. But the most remarkable discoveries at Casas del Turuñuelo have come from the upper floor of the building, which was preserved almost intact by the careful burial process. Here, archaeologists found rooms still containing their original furnishings, including wooden furniture, textiles, and organic materials that normally do not survive in archaeological contexts. One room contained what appears to have been a banquet hall with benches arranged around the walls and a central area where food would have been served. The preservation was so complete that archaeologists could determine the original colors of painted wall decorations and even identify the types of wood used in furniture construction. Another room yielded evidence of literacy and record-keeping in the form of clay tablets bearing Tartessian inscriptions. These tablets, though still not fully deciphered, appear to contain lists of names and numbers that may represent inventories or administrative records. Their discovery confirms that the Tartessians had developed not just the ability to write, but the bureaucratic systems that required written records. The organic materials preserved at Casas del Turuñuelo have provided unprecedented insights into daily life in Tartessian society. Textile fragments show that Tartessian weavers produced fabrics of remarkable quality, using techniques that created complex patterns and employed dyes that produced rich, lasting colors. Wooden objects include furniture pieces that demonstrate sophisticated joinery techniques and decorative carving that rivals the best work of later periods. Most remarkably, the site has yielded evidence of Tartessian artistic traditions in the form of wall paintings and decorative objects that show a distinctive local style. While these works show influences from across the Mediterranean world, they represent a unique synthesis that created something genuinely new and original. The animal remains found at Casas del Turuñuelo provide evidence for the economic basis of Tartessian society. The bones include not just domestic animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs, but also horses, which played important roles in both transportation and ritual activities. The presence of horse bones in ritual contexts suggests that these animals held special significance in Tartessian religion and social practices. Wild animal bones include species that are no longer found in this region, providing evidence for environmental changes that occurred after the abandonment of the site. The variety of species represented suggests that the Tartessians exploited a rich and diverse ecosystem that supported both hunting and animal husbandry. Across all these sites, certain patterns emerge that help define what we mean by Tartessian civilization. The architecture shows consistent use of carefully fitted stone construction techniques that required specialized knowledge and skilled craftsmen. The pottery includes distinctive local styles that evolved over time while incorporating influences from other Mediterranean cultures. The metalwork demonstrates access to raw materials from across Europe and sophisticated techniques for working both bronze and precious metals. The burial practices reveal social hierarchies and religious beliefs that remained consistent across different sites and time periods. Perhaps most importantly, the evidence for writing and record-keeping suggests that the Tartessians had developed the administrative systems that are characteristic of true urban civilization. This was not simply a collection of wealthy chieftains ruling over agricultural villages, but a complex society with specialized crafts, international trade connections, and formal institutions. The deliberate burial of so many Tartessian sites presents both opportunities and challenges for archaeologists. On one hand, this process has preserved organic materials and architectural details that would normally have been lost to decay and weathering. On the other hand, it suggests that the end of Tartessian civilization was a complex process that involved conscious decisions about what to preserve and what to abandon. The evidence suggests that as Tartessian society faced challenges in the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, its leaders chose to carefully dismantle and bury their most important buildings rather than abandon them to decay or destruction. This may have been a religious practice, an attempt to preserve sacred sites for future generations, or a practical response to changing political conditions. Whatever the motivation, this practice has created an archaeological record that is both rich and fragmentary. We have excellent preservation of individual sites and spectacular artifacts, but we still lack a complete picture of how Tartessian society was organized and how it changed over time. The material evidence for Tartessian civilization paints a picture of a society that was wealthy, sophisticated, and well connected to the broader Mediterranean world. This was not the primitive barbarian culture that earlier scholars had imagined, but a genuine civilization that could hold its own beside the great cultures of antiquity. Yet many questions remain unanswered. We still do not know the location of the capital city that ancient sources described as the heart of Tartessian power. We cannot fully read the inscriptions that the Tartessians left behind. We do not understand the political systems that governed their society or the religious beliefs that motivated their actions. What we do know is that the ancient Greek and Roman sources were not describing a mythical land but a real civilization whose material remains continue to surprise and illuminate us. Far from being a legend, Tartessos was one of Europe's first great kingdoms, a bridge between the Bronze Age world of prehistoric Europe and the urban civilizations of the Mediterranean. In the bronze light of dawn, as the mist lifts from the waters of the ancient Guadalquivir, we can almost imagine the scene that would have greeted visitors to the Tartessian heartland 3,000 years ago. Ships with eyes painted on their prows would be arriving from distant shores, their holds heavy with cargo from the far reaches of the Mediterranean world. On the docks, merchants would be conducting business in a babel of languages, their conversations punctuated by the clink of silver and the rustle of precious fabrics. This was Tartessos at the height of its power, a civilization that had built its prosperity on one of the most remarkable foundations in the ancient world: the abundance of precious metals that nature had deposited in the hills and rivers of southwestern Spain. But wealth alone does not create a civilization. What transformed these natural riches into cultural achievement was the encounter between the indigenous peoples of Iberia and the most sophisticated traders of the ancient Mediterranean, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the great merchants of antiquity, a people who had turned their homeland along the eastern Mediterranean coast into the center of a commercial empire that stretched from their cities of Tyre and Sidon to distant colonies in North Africa and Spain. They were master navigators who had learned to read the stars and currents, skilled craftsmen who produced luxury goods coveted throughout the ancient world, and shrewd businessmen who understood that profit came not just from trade but from the relationships that made trade possible. When Phoenician ships first arrived at the mouth of the Guadalquivir, probably sometime in the 9th century before Christ, they found a land that seemed almost too good to be true. The rivers carried gold and silver in their gravels, accessible to anyone with the knowledge to separate precious metals from ordinary sediment. The mountains held veins of copper and tin, the essential ingredients for bronze, the miracle metal that had transformed human civilization. But perhaps most importantly, they found people who were eager to learn and trade. The indigenous inhabitants of this region were not primitive isolationists, but sophisticated communities who had already developed impressive skills in metallurgy and craftsmanship. They possessed something the Phoenicians needed, the raw materials that fed Mediterranean demand for precious metals, while the Phoenicians possessed something the locals desired, access to the wider world of Mediterranean luxury and learning. The relationship that developed between the Phoenicians and the people who would become known as Tartessians was not one of simple colonial exploitation. Instead, it appears to have been a partnership that benefited both sides, creating a hybrid culture that combined the best elements of both traditions. The Phoenicians provided technological knowledge, artistic influences, and access to international markets. The Tartessians contributed their understanding of local conditions, their skills in extracting and working metals, and their position as intermediaries between the coast and the resource-rich interior. This collaboration is visible throughout the archaeological record of Tartessian sites. At Cerro del Carambolo, the building techniques show clear Phoenician influence, with construction methods that mirror those used in Phoenician colonies throughout the Western Mediterranean. Yet the overall design and decoration of the buildings incorporate local preferences and adapt Mediterranean architectural forms to Iberian conditions. The famous golden jewelry found at the site represents perhaps the finest example of this cultural synthesis. The techniques used to create these masterpieces, including granulation and filigree work, were clearly learned from Phoenician craftsmen who had perfected these methods in workshops from Cyprus to Carthage. Yet the designs themselves show distinctively local preferences, with decorative motifs that appear nowhere else in the Phoenician world. The ivory plaques found at various Tartessian sites tell a similar story. These exquisitely carved objects, which decorated furniture and served as luxury items in elite households, were made using techniques developed in the Phoenician homeland. Yet many of them depict scenes and figures that reflect local Iberian mythologies and artistic preferences rather than the standard Phoenician repertoire. At the heart of this relationship was the exchange of knowledge about metallurgy, the fundamental technology that made Tartessian wealth possible. The Phoenicians were master metalworkers who had developed advanced techniques for extracting metals from ores, creating complex alloys, and fashioning finished products that combined functionality with beauty. They brought to Iberia not just tools and techniques, but an entire technological system that could transform raw materials into valuable trade goods. The Tartessians proved to be eager students. Chemical analysis of bronze objects from Tartessian sites shows that local metalworkers quickly mastered the complex art of creating bronze alloys with precisely controlled compositions. They learned to add just the right amount of tin to copper to create bronze that was hard enough for tools and weapons, yet workable enough for decorative objects. More remarkably, they began to innovate on the techniques they had learned, developing new methods that were particularly suited to local conditions and resources. Some Tartessian bronzes show alloy compositions that are unique to Iberia, suggesting that local metalworkers were not merely copying foreign techniques, but adapting and improving upon them. The silver working techniques developed in Tartessian workshops were particularly advanced. The region's abundant silver deposits provided raw material for objects of exceptional quality, including some of the finest silver vessels and jewelry known from the ancient world. Tartessian silversmiths learned to work this precious metal in ways that created objects of stunning beauty and remarkable technical sophistication. The trade networks that developed around Tartessian metals were truly international in scope. Archaeological evidence shows that Tartessian silver and bronze reached markets throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Objects bearing distinctively Tartessian characteristics have been found in sites from southern France to North Africa, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. But the trade was not one-directional. In exchange for their metals, the Tartessians imported luxury goods from across the ancient world. Greek pottery, with its sophisticated painted decorations and high-quality ceramic technology, appears regularly in Tartessian archaeological contexts. These vessels were not merely containers for trade goods, but valued objects in their own right, prized for their beauty and the prestige they represented. Phoenician amphorae, the ancient equivalent of shipping containers, are found in enormous quantities at Tartessian sites. These vessels carried not just wine and oil, but a whole range of exotic products that connected the Tartessians to the broader Mediterranean economy. Some contained precious perfumes and spices from the eastern Mediterranean. Others held dyes and pigments that allowed Tartessian craftsmen to create textiles and decorative objects in colors that would otherwise have been impossible to achieve. Perhaps most remarkably, some trade goods traveled even further distances to reach Tartessian markets. Amber from the Baltic Sea has been found in Tartessian graves, evidence of trade connections that spanned the entire European continent. Ivory from African elephants was carved by Tartessian craftsmen into decorative objects that combined exotic materials with local artistic traditions. The economic foundation of this trade was the remarkable abundance of silver in the Tartessian region. Ancient sources consistently emphasize the extraordinary wealth of this metal in southwestern Spain, and modern geological surveys confirm that the region contained some of the richest silver deposits in the ancient world. The famous mines of the Sierra Morena Mountains produced silver of exceptional purity, while the river systems carried additional deposits that could be recovered through placer mining techniques. The scale of ancient silver extraction in this region was truly remarkable. Modern estimates suggest that the total amount of silver produced in the Tartessian region during the first millennium before Christ may have exceeded the output of all other ancient mining regions combined. This was wealth on a scale that could support entire civilizations and influence the development of monetary systems throughout the Mediterranean world. But silver was not the only source of Tartessian prosperity. The region also possessed abundant deposits of copper, essential for bronze production, and tin, the scarcer metal that was required to create bronze alloys. The combination of these metals in a single region was extremely rare in the ancient world and gave the Tartessians a virtual monopoly on high-quality bronze production in the western Mediterranean. The tin deposits of northwestern Spain were particularly valuable because tin was relatively scarce throughout the Mediterranean region. Most ancient civilizations had to import this essential metal from distant sources, often through complex trade networks that were vulnerable to political disruption. The Tartessians' control of local tin sources gave them a significant advantage in bronze production and made them essential partners for any civilization that depended on bronze technology. The Phoenicians understood the strategic importance of these resources and worked systematically to develop trading relationships that would give them reliable access to Iberian metals. They established permanent settlements along the Spanish coast, creating a network of trading posts and colonies that could process raw materials and serve as bases for further exploration and exploitation. The most important of these Phoenician settlements was Gardia, modern Cadiz, founded according to ancient sources in the year 1104 before Christ. This city, located on an island near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, was perfectly positioned to control trade between the Tartessian heartland and the broader Mediterranean world. From Gardia, Phoenician merchants could monitor the flow of goods down the river, provide services to Tartessian traders, and ensure that their own interests were protected in this lucrative but distant market. Other Phoenician settlements dotted the Spanish coast, each one serving as a link in the chain that connected Iberian resources to Mediterranean markets. These colonies were not just trading posts, but complete communities with temples, workshops, and residential areas that supported permanent populations of Phoenician settlers and their descendants. The relationship between these Phoenician colonies and the Tartessian settlements of the interior appears to have been generally cooperative rather than exploitative. Unlike later colonial relationships that were based on military conquest and political domination, the Phoenician presence in Iberia seems to have been based on mutual benefit and voluntary exchange. This cooperative relationship was facilitated by the Phoenician approach to colonial settlement, which emphasized trade and cultural exchange rather than territorial conquest. The Phoenicians were merchants first and conquerors second, more interested in establishing profitable trading relationships than in political domination. They had learned from their experiences throughout the Mediterranean that voluntary trading partners were often more reliable and productive than conquered subjects. The evidence for this cooperation can be seen in the archaeological record of both Phoenician and Tartessian sites. Phoenician colonies in Spain show clear evidence of cultural exchange with local populations, including the adoption of local pottery styles and architectural techniques. Similarly, Tartessian sites show extensive use of Phoenician technologies and artistic influences, but these are integrated with local traditions rather than simply replacing them. The religious sphere provides particularly clear evidence of cultural synthesis. Phoenician deities appear in Tartessian religious contexts, but they are often combined with local gods and goddesses in ways that create new syncretic traditions. Temples at Tartessian sites show architectural influences from Phoenician religious buildings, but they are adapted to local worship practices and incorporate distinctively Iberian elements. The development of writing in the Tartessian region also shows this pattern of cultural exchange. The Tartessian script, one of the earliest writing systems in Western Europe, was clearly influenced by Phoenician alphabetic principles, yet it was adapted to record the Tartessian language, which appears to have been quite different from Phoenician or any other known ancient language. The ability to write was not merely a practical skill but a marker of civilizational achievement that placed the Tartessians among the elite cultures of the ancient world. The fact that they developed their own distinctive script rather than simply adopting Phoenician writing wholesale suggests a level of cultural confidence and sophistication that speaks to the success of their hybrid civilization. The economic prosperity generated by this Phoenician-Tartessian partnership had profound effects on the development of both cultures. For the Phoenicians, access to Iberian metals helped fund their expansion throughout the Western Mediterranean and their competition with Greek traders for control of lucrative markets. For the Tartessians, participation in Mediterranean trade networks brought not just material wealth but exposure to ideas and technologies that accelerated their cultural development. This prosperity is visible in the archaeological record through the increasing sophistication of Tartessian material culture over time. Early Tartessian sites show evidence of local prosperity but relatively simple material culture. Later sites from the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ show evidence of wealth and sophistication that rivals contemporary civilizations anywhere in the Mediterranean world. The social effects of this prosperity were equally profound. The concentration of wealth from metal trade allowed for the development of specialized crafts and the support of non-productive elites who could devote themselves to religious, artistic, and administrative activities. This social differentiation is visible in the burial record, where elite graves contain increasingly rich grave goods that reflect both local wealth and international connections. Yet this prosperity also created vulnerabilities that would eventually contribute to the decline of Tartessian civilization. The dependence on international trade meant that political or economic disruptions elsewhere in the Mediterranean could have serious effects on Tartessian prosperity. The concentration of wealth in the hands of elites may have created social tensions that weakened the foundations of Tartessian society. Most importantly, the partnership with the Phoenicians tied Tartessian fortunes to the broader political developments of the Eastern Mediterranean. When the Phoenician homeland came under pressure from Assyrian and later Babylonian empires, the effects were felt throughout the Phoenician colonial network, including their partnerships in Iberia. The story of Tartessian trade and wealth is thus also the story of the opportunities and risks that come with participation in international economic systems. The same networks that brought prosperity and cultural development to southwestern Spain also created dependencies that would prove difficult to maintain when the broader Mediterranean world entered a period of political and economic upheaval in the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ. Sometimes civilizations end not with the crash of falling walls or the roar of invading armies, but with the quiet closing of doors, the careful burial of treasures, and the gradual fading of voices that once echoed through busy marketplaces. The end of Tartessos was not a single catastrophic event, but a slow transformation that unfolded over the course of several generations, leaving behind a mystery that would puzzle scholars for centuries. By the middle of the 5th century before Christ, something had changed in the Tartessian heartland. The great ceremonial centers that had dominated the landscape for centuries were being systematically dismantled and buried. The international trade networks that had brought prosperity and cultural exchange were contracting. The distinctive material culture that had marked Tartessian identity was giving way to something different, something that seemed to belong more to the broader Iberian world than to the unique hybrid civilization that had flourished beside the Guadalquivir River. Understanding why this happened requires us to look beyond the borders of Tartessos itself to examine the broader forces that were reshaping the Mediterranean world during this crucial period. The 6th and 5th centuries before Christ were times of profound political and economic upheaval throughout the ancient world, when old powers fell and new ones rose, when established trade routes were disrupted and new ones created. In the eastern Mediterranean, the great Phoenician cities that had been the heart of the trading network were facing existential threats. Tyre, the greatest of the Phoenician commercial centers, fell to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar after a siege that lasted 13 years, from 585 to 572 before Christ. This was not merely the conquest of a single city, but the destruction of the center of a commercial empire that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. The fall of Tyre sent shockwaves throughout the Phoenician colonial network. Cities and settlements that had depended on the mother city for political protection, commercial connections, and cultural identity suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable. The carefully maintained trading relationships that had connected Spain to the eastern Mediterranean began to break down as Phoenician merchants found themselves unable to maintain their traditional routes and partnerships. But even before Tyre fell, other forces were reshaping the Western Mediterranean in ways that threatened the foundations of Tartessian prosperity. The rise of Carthage as the dominant power in North Africa created a new political reality that gradually squeezed out the older, more cooperative trading relationships that had characterized earlier Phoenician colonization. Carthage was a different kind of power than the Phoenician cities of the East. While the older Phoenician settlements had been primarily commercial in nature, focused on trade and cultural exchange, Carthage was an imperial power that sought political and military control over the territories and resources it needed. The Carthaginian approach to colonial expansion was more aggressive and centralized than the older Phoenician model, less willing to tolerate independent partners and more determined to establish direct control over valuable resources. As Carthaginian influence expanded across the Western Mediterranean, the autonomous trading relationships that had allowed Tartessos to flourish began to come under pressure. The Carthaginians were less interested in cultural partnership and more focused on extracting maximum economic benefit from their colonial territories. They established their own mining operations in Spain and developed their own networks for processing and distributing metals, gradually displacing the Tartessian middlemen who had previously controlled these activities. The evidence for this transition can be seen in the archaeological record of the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ. Sites that had previously shown the distinctive material culture of Tartessian civilization began to show increasing influence from Carthaginian sources. Local pottery styles gave way to standardized Carthaginian forms. The unique Tartessian script disappeared from inscriptions, replaced by Carthaginian or Latin writing systems. Perhaps most significantly, the pattern of settlement began to change. The complex system of riverine settlements that had characterized Tartessian civilization gave way to a more coastal orientation that reflected Carthaginian strategic priorities. The interior regions that had been the source of Tartessian wealth became increasingly isolated from the main currents of Mediterranean trade. But political and economic factors alone cannot explain the transformation of Tartessian civilization. Environmental changes also played a crucial role in altering the foundations upon which this culture had been built. The same geographic processes that had originally created the wealth of the Tartessian region were continuing to operate, gradually transforming the landscape in ways that made the traditional Tartessian way of life increasingly difficult to maintain. The silting of the Guadalquivir river system, which we discussed in our exploration of Tartessian geography, accelerated during this period. The complex network of navigable waterways that had allowed Tartessian settlements to control trade between the coast and the interior was gradually becoming less accessible to ocean-going vessels. The deep harbors that had accommodated ships from across the Mediterranean were filling with sediment, forcing maritime traffic to seek alternative ports. This process was probably accelerated by climate change and deforestation. The period from approximately 600 to 400 before Christ saw increasing aridity across much of the Mediterranean region. In Spain, this meant that the forests that had covered the mountains for millennia began to thin out, replaced by the scrubland vegetation that characterizes much of the region today. The loss of forest cover had cascading effects on the river systems that fed the Tartessian heartland. Without tree roots to hold soil in place, erosion increased dramatically during heavy rains. More sediment was carried into the rivers, accelerating the process of channel filling that was already making navigation difficult. The seasonal floods that had brought both water and fertile silt to agricultural areas became more destructive and less predictable. At the same time, the placer deposits that had provided easily accessible precious metals were becoming exhausted after centuries of intensive exploitation. The river gravels that had once yielded gold and silver to anyone with the patience to wash them were no longer producing enough metal to support the large-scale trading operations that had made Tartessos wealthy. The mountain mines that had supplemented river placer mining were also facing increasing difficulties. The easiest surface deposits had been worked out, requiring miners to dig deeper and invest more labor to extract the same quantities of metal. The technology available to ancient miners was not adequate for deep underground mining, so as surface deposits became exhausted, production inevitably declined. These environmental challenges created a vicious cycle that undermined the economic foundations of Tartessian civilization. Declining metal production reduced the resources available for maintaining the infrastructure and political systems that supported mining activities. Reduced prosperity meant less investment in environmental management, accelerating the degradation of the river systems that were essential to Tartessian commerce. The social and political effects of these changes can be traced through the archaeological record of Tartessian sites. The great ceremonial centers that had been the focus of Tartessian religious and political life began to show signs of reduced activity in the 5th century before Christ. Fewer offerings were deposited in sacred spaces. Elaborate ritual complexes fell into disuse or were deliberately decommissioned. The deliberate burial of sites like Cerro del Carambolo and Cancho Roano during this period suggests that the end of Tartessian civilization was not a sudden collapse, but a planned withdrawal. The careful way in which these sites were dismantled and covered with earth speaks to organized decision-making by communities that had time to plan for their own transformation. This process of planned decommissioning may reflect changing religious beliefs or political structures within Tartessian society. Some scholars suggest that the environmental and economic challenges facing the civilization led to a crisis of confidence in the traditional religious and political systems that had sustained it. The burial of sacred sites may have been part of a broader rejection of the old ways in favor of new approaches to organizing society and relating to the divine. Alternatively, the burial process may have been a way of preserving important sites for future generations while acknowledging that current conditions made it impossible to maintain them properly. The careful way in which buildings were dismantled and artifacts removed before burial suggests a hope that these places might someday be restored and reactivated when circumstances permitted. The transformation of Tartessian civilization was not uniform across the entire region. Some areas seem to have maintained elements of traditional Tartessian culture well into the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ, while others were more quickly integrated into new political and economic systems. This patchwork pattern of change suggests that local conditions and choices played important roles in determining how different communities responded to the broader forces that were reshaping their world. In some coastal areas, communities seem to have adapted relatively successfully to Carthaginian domination, finding new roles within the imperial system that allowed them to maintain some degree of prosperity and autonomy. These settlements often show continuity of occupation through the period of transition, with gradual changes in material culture that suggest adaptation rather than abandonment. In the interior regions that had been the heart of Tartessian mining operations, the transformation was often more dramatic. Many settlements were abandoned entirely as their economic foundations disappeared. Others contracted significantly, supporting much smaller populations with more limited material culture. Yet even in these areas, the transition was not always complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities maintained knowledge of traditional Tartessian crafts and cultural practices long after the political and economic systems that had originally supported them had disappeared. Pottery techniques, metalworking skills, and artistic traditions continued to influence local culture even as their original context was transformed. The linguistic evidence for this period is particularly intriguing but also frustratingly incomplete. The Tartessian script, which had been used for official inscriptions and religious purposes during the height of the civilization, gradually disappeared from the archaeological record during the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ. The last known Tartessian inscriptions date to approximately 400 before Christ, marking the end of one of Europe's earliest writing traditions. However, linguistic analysis suggests that the Tartessian language may have continued to be spoken in some areas long after the script was abandoned. Later Roman sources describe the Turdetani, a people who inhabited much of the former Tartessian territory, as possessing ancient laws and historical records that may have preserved elements of Tartessian culture in oral form. The Roman historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century after Christ, described the Turdetani as the most civilized of the Iberian peoples, possessing a level of cultural sophistication that seemed to echo the ancient Greek accounts of Tartessian civilization. He noted that they had ancient written laws and claimed to possess historical records that stretched back 6,000 years, though these were no longer written in their original script. This suggests that the end of Tartessian civilization was not the complete destruction of a culture, but its transformation into something new. The people who had called themselves Tartessians may have become the Turdetani, adapting their traditional culture to new political and economic realities while maintaining some continuity with their past. The process of cultural transformation was probably accelerated by intermarriage and population movement. As the old political boundaries broke down, people moved more freely between different regions and communities. Tartessian traditions mixed with those of other Iberian groups, creating new hybrid cultures that combined elements from multiple sources. The Roman conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which began in the 3rd century before Christ and was completed in the 1st century after Christ, represented the final stage in the transformation of the Tartessian cultural area. Roman administration, law, and culture gradually replaced the last vestiges of pre-Roman political and social systems, though some elements of local tradition continued to influence regional culture for centuries. Ironically, it was the Romans who preserved many of the ancient accounts of Tartessian civilization that allow us to study it today. Roman historians and geographers were fascinated by the wealth and sophistication of the ancient Iberian cultures they had conquered, and they carefully recorded the stories and traditions that connected their new territories to the broader history of the Mediterranean world. Yet, even as they preserved these memories, the Romans were completing the process of transformation that had begun centuries earlier. The construction of Roman cities, roads, and administrative systems created new patterns of settlement and economic activity that finally erased the last traces of the geographic and cultural landscape that had supported Tartessian civilization. The disappearance of Tartessos thus represents not a single moment of destruction, but a long process of adaptation and transformation that unfolded over several centuries. Environmental changes, political upheavals, and economic pressures combined to make the traditional Tartessian way of life increasingly difficult to maintain. Rather than fighting these changes, Tartessian communities seem to have chosen to adapt, gradually transforming their culture and identity to fit new circumstances. This process of adaptation may have been so successful that the descendants of the Tartessians continued to thrive in their transformed homeland for centuries after the original civilization had disappeared. The wealth and sophistication that Roman sources attributed to the peoples of southern Spain may have been the legacy of Tartessian cultural achievements, preserved and adapted across generations of change. The story of Tartessian decline and disappearance thus becomes a story about resilience and adaptation as much as about loss and destruction. It reminds us that civilizations are not fixed entities but dynamic systems that must constantly adapt to changing circumstances. The end of Tartessos was not a failure but a transformation, the beginning of a new chapter in the long history of human settlement in southwestern Spain. Somewhere beneath the quiet marshlands of southwestern Spain lies one of archaeology's greatest prizes, the lost capital of Tartessos, a city that ancient sources described as the greatest settlement in the Western world, yet which has eluded discovery for more than 2,000 years. The search for this vanished metropolis has become one of the most fascinating detective stories in modern archaeology, combining cutting-edge technology with patient detective work in an effort to solve a mystery that has tantalized scholars since the Renaissance. The ancient sources leave little doubt that such a capital existed. Greek and Roman writers consistently described Tartessos not just as a region or a people, but as a specific place, a great city that served as the political and commercial center of the civilization that bore its name. Strabo, writing with access to sources that are now lost to us, described it as a city of remarkable wealth and sophistication, built on an island at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, where multiple channels created a complex pattern of waterways. According to these ancient accounts, the city of Tartessos was unlike anything else in the Western Mediterranean. It was said to possess harbors that could accommodate hundreds of ships, warehouses that stored the wealth of nations, and palaces that rivaled those of the Eastern kingdoms in their splendor. The streets were reportedly laid out in a planned grid pattern that showed sophisticated urban planning, while the buildings themselves incorporated architectural techniques learned from across the Mediterranean world. Most remarkably, the ancient sources suggested that the city possessed written records that documented its history across thousands of years. If true, this would have made it not just the political capital of Tartessian civilization, but also its intellectual center, a place where knowledge was accumulated and preserved in ways that were rare in the ancient world. Yet despite these detailed ancient descriptions, despite centuries of searching by archaeologists and treasure hunters, despite the application of increasingly sophisticated scientific techniques, the location of this great city remains unknown. It has become archaeology's equivalent of a ghost story, a place that seems to exist in the realm between fact and legend, tantalizingly real, yet frustratingly elusive. The search for Tartessos has taken archaeologists and adventurers across the length and breadth of southwestern Spain. Every promising hill, every ancient settlement, every anomaly in the landscape has been investigated as a potential site for the lost capital. Some searches have been guided by careful analysis of ancient texts and modern geographical knowledge. Others have been driven more by intuition and hope than by scientific methodology. The 19th century saw numerous expeditions mounted by European scholars convinced that they could solve the mystery through careful application of classical learning and emerging archaeological techniques. German archaeologists, inspired by Heinrich Schliemann's discovery of Troy, were particularly active in the search, convinced that systematic excavation would eventually reveal the Tartessian capital, just as it had revealed Homer's legendary city. These early expeditions focused primarily on inland sites, particularly around the modern city of Seville, which seemed to match some of the geographical descriptions found in ancient sources. The rich agricultural lands of the Guadalquivir Valley had supported continuous settlement for millennia, creating a landscape dotted with tells and mounds that marked the locations of ancient communities. Several of these sites yielded impressive archaeological remains that seemed to confirm the existence of a sophisticated ancient civilization in the region. The discovery of the Carambolo treasure in 1958 provided dramatic confirmation that the ancient sources had not been describing a mythical land but a real place inhabited by people capable of extraordinary artistic and technical achievements. Yet none of these inland discoveries seemed quite substantial enough to represent the great capital city described in ancient sources. The sites were clearly important, clearly wealthy, clearly connected to broader Mediterranean trade networks, but they lacked the scale and monumental architecture that would be expected of a major urban center. Gradually, attention began to shift toward the coast itself, to the possibility that the Tartessian capital might lie not inland, but in the coastal marshes where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic Ocean. This shift was driven partly by more careful reading of the ancient sources, which consistently described Tartessos as being located on or near the coast, and partly by growing understanding of how dramatically the coastal geography of this region had changed over the past 3,000 years. The key insight came from studies of sediment deposition and coastal change that revealed how different the Guadalquivir Delta had been in ancient times. Where we see solid ground today, ancient peoples would have seen a complex archipelago of islands and waterways. Where modern maps show a simple river mouth, ancient navigators would have encountered a maze of channels that required local knowledge to navigate safely. This transformed understanding of ancient geography suggested that the Tartessian capital might lie buried beneath the very marshlands that today constitute some of Europe's most important wildlife habitat. The Doñana National Park, established to protect the extraordinary ecosystem of the Guadalquivir Delta, might be concealing beneath its protected wetlands the remains of one of Europe's first great cities. The possibility was both exciting and frustrating. If the capital of Tartessos indeed lay beneath Doñana, it would be preserved in extraordinary condition by the waterlogged sediments that had buried it. Organic materials that normally decay within decades of burial could survive for millennia in the anaerobic conditions created by permanent waterlogging. Buildings, artifacts, even written records might be preserved in a state that would allow unprecedented insights into ancient urban life. But the same environmental protections that preserved this ecosystem from modern development also made large-scale archaeological investigation impossible. Doñana National Park is one of Europe's most strictly protected natural areas, designated as both a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a biosphere reserve. Any archaeological work within its boundaries must be carefully limited to ensure that it does not damage the fragile ecosystems that the park was created to preserve. This restriction created a unique challenge for archaeologists: how to search for a lost city within an area where traditional excavation techniques were forbidden. The solution lay in the development and application of remote sensing technologies that could detect buried archaeological features without disturbing the overlying sediments. The first systematic attempt to use remote sensing to search for Tartessos began in the 1990s, when a joint German-Spanish team led by archaeologist Sebastián Celestino began using aerial photography and satellite imagery to look for anomalies in the Doñana landscape that might indicate buried structures. The results were immediately intriguing. High-resolution satellite images revealed subtle but consistent patterns in the vegetation and surface topography of the marshlands that suggested the presence of buried structures. In some areas, slight elevations in the otherwise flat landscape created linear patterns that looked suspiciously like the outlines of ancient walls or streets. In others, variations in plant growth created geometric shapes that seemed too regular to be natural. The most promising discoveries came from an area near the town of Hinojos, where satellite imagery revealed a complex pattern of rectangular shapes buried beneath several meters of marsh sediment. The shapes were organized in what appeared to be a grid pattern, suggesting planned urban development rather than natural geological formations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of this area, conducted with minimal disturbance to the surface environment, confirmed the presence of substantial buried structures. The radar revealed what appeared to be stone foundations extending over an area of several hectares, organized in a pattern that strongly suggested ancient urban planning. Magnetometer surveys, which detect subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried archaeological features, provided additional evidence for ancient human activity in the area. The magnetic signatures suggested the presence of fired clay structures, possibly kilns or furnaces, as well as areas of concentrated metalworking debris that might indicate ancient industrial activities. Most remarkably, the geophysical surveys revealed what appeared to be a sophisticated water management system, with channels and basins that seemed designed to control flooding and provide fresh water to urban populations. This kind of hydraulic engineering would be entirely consistent with a major ancient city built in a coastal marsh environment. The evidence was tantalizing but not conclusive. Remote sensing can reveal the presence of buried structures, but cannot determine their age or cultural affiliation without direct examination of artifacts and stratigraphic context. The rectangular patterns detected by satellite imagery might represent ancient Tartessian buildings, but they could equally well be Roman structures, medieval settlements, or even relatively recent agricultural installations. To resolve these questions would require carefully controlled excavation the kind of detailed archaeological work that environmental protections made difficult or impossible within Doñana National Park. The research team was faced with a frustrating paradox. The very conditions that had preserved potential Tartessian remains also made it nearly impossible to study them. The solution came through the development of even more sophisticated remote sensing techniques that could provide detailed information about buried structures without requiring excavation. Three-dimensional ground-penetrating radar systems could create detailed images of buried architecture, showing not just the horizontal extent of structures but their vertical profiles as well. Electrical resistivity surveys could detect subtle variations in soil composition that might indicate different types of building materials or varying degrees of preservation. Electromagnetic induction surveys could identify areas of metallic concentration that might represent ancient workshops or depositories of metal artifacts. Perhaps most promisingly, advances in sediment coring techniques allowed researchers to extract narrow columns of earth that could provide detailed information about site formation processes and cultural deposits without causing significant environmental disturbance. Analysis of these cores could reveal layers containing pottery sherds, charcoal, or other cultural materials that could be dated and identified. The results of this intensive remote sensing campaign, conducted over more than 2 decades by teams from universities across Europe, have gradually built a compelling case that significant ancient urban remains do indeed lie buried beneath the Doñana marshlands. The accumulated evidence suggests the presence of a substantial settlement that was occupied during the first millennium before Christ, and that possessed many of the characteristics that ancient sources attributed to the Tartessian capital. However, the evidence remains tantalizingly incomplete. The remote sensing data can tell us that buried structures exist, but it cannot provide the kind of detailed cultural information that would come from traditional archaeological excavation. We know that something substantial lies beneath the marsh sediments, but we cannot be certain what it is or who built it. Recent advances in environmental archaeology have opened new possibilities for studying these buried sites without causing ecological damage. Techniques developed for investigating shipwrecks and other underwater archaeological sites have been adapted for use in waterlogged terrestrial environments, allowing researchers to extract samples and even small artifacts without disturbing the broader archaeological context. Paleo-environmental studies, which examine ancient pollen seeds and other organic remains, can provide detailed information about past landscapes and human activities without requiring large-scale excavation. These studies have revealed evidence for ancient agriculture, metallurgy, and other human activities in areas where remote sensing has detected buried structures. Most recently, advances in LiDAR technology, which uses laser scanning to create detailed topographic maps, have revealed additional geometric patterns in the Doñana landscape that may represent previously unknown archaeological sites. These discoveries suggest that the buried remains may be even more extensive than originally thought, possibly representing not just a single large settlement, but an entire network of connected urban centers. The cumulative effect of all this research has been to build a strong circumstantial case that the lost capital of Tartessos does indeed lie somewhere beneath the protected landscapes of southwestern Spain. The evidence is not yet conclusive enough to pinpoint an exact location or to confirm the identification beyond doubt, but it is substantial enough to keep the search active and to justify continued investment in new technologies and techniques. The hunt for Tartessos has thus become a proving ground for new approaches to archaeological investigation, demonstrating how modern technology can be used to study the past without destroying the environmental and cultural heritage that we seek to understand. It has shown that some of archaeology's greatest discoveries may still lie waiting beneath our feet, preserved by the same natural processes that have hidden them from view. Perhaps most importantly, the search for the Tartessian capital has reminded us that the landscape itself is an archaeological artifact, shaped by thousands of years of human activity and natural change. Understanding how past societies adapted to and modified their environments is essential to understanding how we might better manage our own relationship with the natural world. The lost city of Tartessos remains lost, but the search for it continues to yield insights that extend far beyond the specific question of where it might be found. Each new technique that is developed, each new piece of evidence that is uncovered, Each new interpretation that is proposed adds to our understanding not just of this particular ancient civilization, but of the broader human story of which it forms a part. In the quiet marshlands of Doñana, beneath the calls of migrating birds and the whisper of wind through reeds, the stones of Tartessos wait patiently for the day when technology and environmental stewardship can finally work together to reveal their secrets without destroying the natural heritage that has protected them for so long. In the silence of ancient stones, voices from the past still speak to us, though in whispers we struggle to understand. Carved into rock faces and inscribed on bronze plaques, nearly 100 inscriptions preserve the words of the Tartessian people in their own script, their own language, their own way of making meaning from the sounds of human speech. These inscriptions represent some of the earliest writing in Western Europe, a literary tradition that flourished when much of the continent still depended entirely on memory and oral tradition to preserve knowledge across generations. The story of Tartessian writing begins with the recognition that these mysterious inscriptions, scattered across southwestern Spain and southern Portugal, represented something unique in the ancient world. For decades, scholars had noticed these strange markings on stones and artifacts, but they had been dismissed as decorative patterns or attributed to later Roman or medieval scribes. It was only in the mid-20th century that researchers began to recognize them as examples of a coherent writing system that predated Roman conquest by several centuries. The breakthrough came when Spanish linguist Jürgen Untermann began systematic analysis of these inscriptions in the 1970s, applying the careful comparative methods that had been used to decipher other ancient scripts. What he discovered was a writing system of remarkable sophistication, one that had adapted the alphabetic principles developed by the Phoenicians to record a language that was entirely different from any known ancient tongue. The Tartessian script itself is a thing of beauty, with characters that seem to dance across the stone surfaces where they were carved. The letters are angular yet flowing, clearly related to Phoenician writing, but adapted and modified in ways that created something distinctively local. Some characters are virtually identical to their Phoenician counterparts, while others have been so modified that their ancestry is barely recognizable. This adaptation process reveals something profound about Tartessian culture and its relationship with the broader Mediterranean world. The Tartessians were not simply copying foreign models, but were actively adapting them to serve their own linguistic and cultural needs. They had taken the revolutionary idea of alphabetic writing and made it their own, creating a script that could capture the sounds and meanings of their own language. The physical appearance of Tartessian inscriptions varies considerably depending on their date and purpose. The earliest examples, dating to the 7th century before Christ, tend to be relatively simple, with short texts that may represent names or brief dedicatory formulas. These early inscriptions often appear on personal objects like jewelry or weapons, suggesting that writing was initially used primarily for marking ownership or identity. Later inscriptions are longer and more complex, indicating that the use of writing had expanded beyond simple labeling to include more elaborate texts. Some of these later examples appear to be dedicatory inscriptions associated with religious sites, while others may represent legal documents or administrative records. The longest Tartessian inscription, found at Fonte Velha in Portugal, contains more than 80 characters and appears to be a substantial text that may have recorded an important legal or religious formula. The process of deciphering these inscriptions has been one of the most challenging tasks in modern linguistics. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, Tartessian texts do not come with convenient bilingual inscriptions that provide ready-made translations. Scholars have had to work with the inscriptions themselves, using comparative analysis and educated guesswork to determine what the characters mean and how the language they record might have sounded. The first step in this process was determining the phonetic values of the Tartessian characters. By comparing them with their Phoenician counterparts and analyzing how they appear in different contexts within the inscriptions, scholars gradually built up a tentative alphabet that could be used to transliterate Tartessian texts into Roman characters. This transliteration revealed that Tartessian was written without vowels, following the Phoenician convention of recording only consonantal sounds. This made interpretation even more challenging, since the same series of consonants could represent multiple different words depending on which vowels were understood to be present. Reading Tartessian is somewhat like trying to understand English text written as Thkuk Brun FX Gem PS VR Thlzidg, possible if you know the language, but extremely difficult for outsiders. Despite these challenges, scholars have made significant progress in understanding at least some aspects of Tartessian language and writing. The most clearly understood elements are proper names, particularly personal names and place names that can sometimes be compared with names recorded in Greek and Roman sources. These comparisons have provided crucial anchor points for understanding how Tartessian phonology and morphology might have worked. Analysis of these names has revealed that Tartessian was probably an Indo-European language related to the great language family that includes most modern European tongues, as well as many ancient languages from Iran to Ireland. However, Tartessian appears to have been quite different from other known Indo-European languages, with features that may represent either very archaic preservation of ancient linguistic patterns or innovative developments that occurred in isolation from other Indo-European communities. Some scholars have suggested that Tartessian might be related to Celtic languages, pointing to similarities in certain name forms and grammatical patterns. Others have argued for connections with Italic languages like Latin, or even with more distant Indo-European branches. The evidence is still too fragmentary to resolve these questions definitively, but the very fact that such connections can be proposed suggests that Tartessian was part of the broader Indo-European linguistic tradition that dominated ancient Europe. Perhaps more important than determining the exact linguistic affiliation of Tartessian is understanding what its existence tells us about Tartessian society and culture. The development of writing represents a crucial threshold in human cultural evolution, marking the transition from purely oral cultures to literate civilizations capable of preserving and transmitting complex information across time and space. The presence of writing in Tartessian society indicates that this culture had reached a level of social complexity that required permanent records. Whether these records were primarily religious, legal, administrative, or commercial in nature, their existence suggests a society with formal institutions that needed to maintain consistent information across extended periods of time. The distribution of Tartessian inscriptions across a wide geographic area, from central Portugal to eastern Andalusia, indicates that literacy was not confined to a single center but was spread throughout the Tartessian cultural region. This suggests either that writing was taught and learned across multiple communities, or that there was sufficient cultural unity and communication to maintain consistent scribal traditions across considerable distances. The contexts in which Tartessian inscriptions appear provide additional insights into how writing was used in this society. Many inscriptions are found on objects associated with religious sites, suggesting that writing played an important role in Tartessian religious practices. These might include dedicatory texts, prayers, or ritual formulas that needed to be preserved in permanent form. Other inscriptions appear on objects associated with elite burials or high-status settlements, indicating that literacy was particularly valued among the upper levels of Tartessian society. This pattern is common in early literate societies, where writing often begins as a specialized skill associated with religious or political authority before gradually spreading to broader segments of the population. Some of the most intriguing Tartessian inscriptions appear on everyday objects like pottery vessels or personal ornaments. These suggest that writing was not exclusively reserved for formal or ceremonial purposes, but was also used for more mundane activities like marking ownership or recording simple information. The artistic quality of many Tartessian inscriptions indicates that the act of writing was valued not just for its practical utility, but also for its aesthetic possibilities. Many texts are carefully laid out with attention to visual balance and decorative effect. Some incorporate the written text into broader decorative schemes that combine script with geometric or figurative designs. This aesthetic dimension of Tartessian writing connects it to the broader artistic traditions of the culture, revealing how different forms of creative expression were integrated in Tartessian society. The same artistic sensibilities that produced the exquisite goldwork of Carambolo or the sophisticated pottery found at Tartessian sites also shaped the visual appearance of written texts. The decline and disappearance of Tartessian writing parallels the broader transformation of Tartessian culture during the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ. The latest Tartessian inscriptions date to approximately 400 before Christ, marking the end of one of Europe's earliest indigenous writing traditions. This disappearance was not necessarily sudden or complete. Some scholars have suggested that Tartessian scribal traditions may have continued in modified form even after the script itself was abandoned. The Roman historian Strabo mentioned that the people he called Turdetani, who inhabited much of the former Tartessian territory, possessed ancient written laws and historical records, though these were apparently no longer maintained in their original script. The transition from Tartessian script to Latin writing represents more than just a change in writing systems. It marks the integration of the Tartessian cultural region into the broader Roman world, with all the profound cultural changes that such integration entailed. Local languages and scripts gave way to Latin, local legal and administrative systems were replaced by Roman institutions, and local religious and cultural practices were gradually transformed by contact with Roman civilization. Yet even as the Tartessian language and script disappeared from active use, their legacy continued to influence the cultural development of southwestern Spain. Linguistic analysis suggests that Tartessian may have left traces in the Latin that was spoken in this region, contributing to the development of the distinctive characteristics that would eventually emerge in Andalusian Spanish. More broadly, the Tartessian writing tradition represents an important chapter in the history of literacy in Europe. It demonstrates that the idea of writing, once introduced to a receptive culture, could be adapted and developed in ways that served local needs and preferences. The Tartessians were not passive recipients of Phoenician literacy, but active participants in the creation of their own literary culture. The study of Tartessian inscriptions continues to yield new insights as more texts are discovered and as analytical techniques become more sophisticated. Digital imaging technologies allow scholars to detect inscriptions that are barely visible to the naked eye, while computer-aided analysis helps identify patterns in the texts that might escape human observers. Perhaps most promisingly, the development of corpus linguistics techniques allows researchers to analyze the entire body of Tartessian inscriptions as a unified dataset, looking for statistical patterns that might reveal grammatical structures or semantic relationships that are not apparent in individual texts. These ongoing studies hold the promise of eventually achieving a more complete understanding of Tartessian language and culture. While we may never be able to read Tartessian texts with the fluency of a native speaker, continued research may allow us to understand enough to appreciate the intellectual achievements of this remarkable civilization. The legacy of Tartessian writing extends beyond the specific texts that have survived to include the broader principle that local cultures can adapt and transform the technologies and ideas they encounter from other societies. The Tartessians demonstrated that innovation often comes not from creating something entirely new, but from taking existing ideas and making them serve new purposes in new contexts. In our own age of rapid cultural and technological exchange, the Tartessian example reminds us that successful adaptation requires not just the ability to adopt foreign innovations, but the creativity to transform them in ways that serve local needs and values. The voices that speak to us from Tartessian inscriptions may be difficult to understand, but they carry a message about human adaptability and creativity that remains relevant across the millennia. The stones that bear these ancient words continue to yield their secrets slowly, like a conversation carried on across thousands of years between cultures separated by vast gulfs of time and understanding. Each newly discovered inscription, each refinement in our understanding of Tartessian grammar and vocabulary, brings us a little closer to hearing those ancient voices with something approaching clarity. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of Tartessian writing is not the specific content of the texts, but the demonstration that human beings have always sought ways to preserve their thoughts and experiences for future generations. The Tartessian scribes who carved these inscriptions could not have imagined that their words would still be studied thousands of years later, but their determination to create permanent records has allowed their culture to speak across the centuries, reminding us that the desire to communicate across time is one of humanity's most enduring characteristics. In the vast library of human memory, some stories are written in golden letters on pages that survive the centuries, while others fade like morning mist, leaving only the faintest traces for future generations to decipher. The forgetting of Tartessos is a puzzle within a puzzle, a mystery that goes beyond the simple question of where this civilization went to ask an even more intriguing question. Why did one of Europe's first great kingdoms disappear so completely from historical consciousness that scholars would spend centuries debating whether it had ever existed at all? To understand how Tartessos could be forgotten, we must first understand how civilizations are remembered. The survival of historical memory depends on a complex interplay of factors: the preservation of physical remains, the continuity of written records, the persistence of oral traditions, and perhaps most importantly, the interests and perspectives of those who write the histories that future generations will read. Ancient civilizations that we remember clearly today typically possessed at least one of several characteristics that helped ensure their historical survival. Some, like Egypt, built monuments so massive and enduring that they could not be overlooked or explained away. Others, like Greece and Rome, created literary and intellectual traditions so influential that later cultures felt compelled to preserve and study their achievements. Still others, like the Hebrew kingdoms, produced religious texts that were cherished and copied by communities that survived long after the original political entities had disappeared. Tartessos possessed none of these advantages. Unlike the Egyptians or Mesopotamians, the Tartessians did not build pyramids or ziggurats that would dominate the landscape for millennia. Their architecture, while sophisticated, was built primarily of materials that were vulnerable to decay and destruction. Stone foundations might survive burial, but the wooden superstructures and organic roofing materials that would have given these buildings their distinctive character vanished long ago. The environmental factors that we explored in our discussion of Tartessian geography played a crucial role in this process of forgetting. The deliberate burial of major Tartessian sites, combined with the natural sedimentation that occurred as river systems changed course and coastal marshes expanded, meant that the physical remains of Tartessian civilization were literally hidden beneath the earth. Unlike the ruins of Greek temples or Roman amphitheaters, which remained visible throughout the medieval period and served as constant reminders of ancient achievement, Tartessian ruins were effectively invisible to later generations. This physical concealment was compounded by the transformation of the landscape itself. The complex system of waterways that had supported Tartessian civilization gradually filled with silt, creating new patterns of land and water that bore little resemblance to the ancient geography. Medieval and early modern travelers through the region would have seen fertile farmland and simple fishing villages, with no obvious indication that they were walking over the remains of an ancient urban civilization. The absence of monumental architecture was not the only factor that contributed to the forgetting of Tartessos. Perhaps even more important was the loss of written records that might have preserved Tartessian historical traditions for later generations to discover and study. While we know that the Tartessians possessed a writing system and may have maintained historical records, none of these documents have survived in their original form. This contrasts sharply with the situation in other parts of the ancient world, where the preservation of written materials allowed later scholars to reconstruct detailed pictures of vanished civilizations. The Linear B tablets from Bronze Age Greece, the cuneiform libraries of Mesopotamia, and the papyrus documents of ancient Egypt all survived in sufficient quantities to provide modern researchers with direct access to ancient thoughts and records. The materials used for writing in the Tartessian world may have been particularly vulnerable to decay. If Tartessian scribes used organic materials like leather, wood, or papyrus for their most important documents, these would have decomposed completely in the humid climate of southwestern Spain. Only inscriptions carved in stone or metal would have had any chance of long-term survival, and even these were vulnerable to deliberate destruction or accidental loss. The cultural disruptions that accompanied the end of Tartessian civilization also contributed to the loss of historical memory. When the political and social systems that supported Tartessian scribal traditions collapsed or were transformed, the knowledge needed to read and interpret Tartessian texts was lost along with them. Even if some written records had survived the transition to Roman rule, there would have been no one left who could understand what they said. This represents a crucial difference between the fate of Tartessian culture and that of other ancient civilizations that maintained historical continuity despite political changes. Greek culture survived the Roman conquest partly because Greek remained a living language and Greek educational traditions continued to operate within the Roman world. Jewish culture survived the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, partly because communities of Jews continued to study and preserve Hebrew texts in diaspora communities throughout the Mediterranean. Tartessian culture lacked these mechanisms for cultural preservation. When the distinctive political and social structures of Tartessian civilization were replaced by Roman institutions, there were apparently no communities that felt a strong enough attachment to Tartessian traditions to maintain them in their original form. The transformation appears to have been so complete that within a few generations, the memory of what had been lost had itself been lost. The role of language in this process of forgetting cannot be underestimated. When a language ceases to be spoken, it takes with it not just the ability to read ancient texts, but also the cultural concepts and ways of thinking that shaped the civilization that spoke it. The disappearance of the Tartessian language meant the disappearance of an entire way of understanding and organizing human experience. This linguistic discontinuity was probably accelerated by the Roman approach to provincial administration, which strongly encouraged the adoption of Latin language and Roman cultural practices throughout the empire. Unlike some other conquering powers, the Romans were generally successful at transforming conquered territories into genuinely Roman provinces, where local languages and customs gave way to imperial standards. The process was undoubtedly gradual and varied from place to place, but the end result was the creation of a Roman Spain where Latin was the language of education, administration, and high culture. Local languages might persist in rural areas or in domestic contexts, but they would not be written down or taught in schools. Within a few generations, the cultural knowledge embedded in these languages would be irretrievably lost. The geographical isolation of the Tartessian heartland from the main centers of Mediterranean scholarship also contributed to the loss of historical memory. Unlike Greek or Egyptian civilization, which were located at the crossroads of ancient trade routes and remained continuously visible to travelers and scholars, Tartessos was located at what many ancient writers considered the edge of the civilized world. When Tartessian civilization ended, there were no nearby academic centers or religious institutions that might have preserved records of its achievements. The libraries of Alexandria or Athens, which maintained copies of thousands of ancient texts, were too distant to have included substantial materials about a civilization at the western edge of the Mediterranean world. This geographical marginality meant that information about Tartessos existed primarily in the travel accounts and geographical works of writers who had visited the region or interviewed people who had. When these sources were lost, or when later scholars lost interest in distant places that no longer seemed politically or economically important, the memory of Tartessos began to fade from the written record. The changing political and economic geography of the Mediterranean world also played a role in the forgetting of Tartessos. During the height of Tartessian civilization, the Western Mediterranean was an important frontier region where different cultures met and interacted. The wealth generated by Iberian metals made this area politically and economically significant to powers throughout the ancient world. By the Roman period, however, the center of Mediterranean civilization had shifted eastward. The most important cities, the wealthiest provinces, and the most influential intellectual centers were all located in the Greek-speaking eastern portion of the empire. Spain, while prosperous, was considered a peripheral region whose primary value lay in its agricultural and mineral resources rather than its cultural achievements. This shift in perspective affected how later Roman writers approached the history of their provinces. They were more interested in documenting the progress of Roman civilization in these areas than in preserving memories of what had existed before Roman conquest. Pre-Roman cultures were often portrayed as primitive or barbaric peoples who had benefited from the civilizing influence of Roman rule. This historiographical bias meant that when Roman writers did mention Tartessos, they often presented it as a curiosity from the distant past, rather than as a serious subject for historical investigation. The sophisticated urban civilization described by earlier Greek sources was gradually transformed in Roman accounts into a collection of wealthy but uncivilized tribes who had been fortunate enough to live in a region with abundant natural resources. The rise of Christianity as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire created additional barriers to the preservation of Tartessian memory. Christian writers were generally uninterested in pagan civilizations except insofar as they could be used to illustrate moral lessons about the futility of worldly achievement or the superiority of Christian civilization. The elaborate religious and ceremonial traditions that had been central to Tartessian culture would have been particularly vulnerable to Christian criticism. The same ritual complexes and sacred sites that had been the focus of Tartessian community life would have been seen by Christian observers as centers of demonic activity that deserved to be forgotten rather than remembered. This religious transformation affected not just the preservation of written records, but also the oral traditions that might have kept Tartessian memories alive among local populations. Stories and songs that celebrated pre-Christian religious practices would have been actively discouraged by Christian authorities, leading to the gradual erosion of folk memories that might otherwise have preserved important historical information. The medieval period brought additional challenges to the preservation of ancient memories. The political fragmentation of the Iberian Peninsula following the collapse of Roman authority meant that there were few stable institutions capable of maintaining scholarly traditions or preserving ancient documents. The successive waves of Visigothic, Islamic, and Christian conquest created repeated disruptions that made the preservation of ancient materials increasingly difficult. The Islamic conquest of Spain in the 8th century after Christ brought a new scholarly tradition to the peninsula, but Islamic historians were primarily interested in Islamic civilization and the pre-Islamic history of the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East. Local Iberian history before the Islamic conquest was generally considered less worthy of detailed study than the great events of Islamic expansion and the achievements of Islamic culture. When Christian scholars began to reassert control over Iberian intellectual life during the Reconquista, they faced the challenge of reconstructing a historical narrative that could legitimize Christian rule while acknowledging the peninsula's complex pre-Christian past. In this context, remote pre-Roman civilizations like Tartessos seemed less relevant than more recent Islamic or Visigothic history. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity, but Renaissance scholars were primarily focused on Greek and Roman texts that could be found in existing manuscript collections. The fragmentary references to Tartessos in ancient sources attracted some attention, but without archaeological evidence to support them, these accounts seemed more mythological than historical. The development of modern archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries finally provided the tools needed to rediscover Tartessian civilization, but by this time the forgetting was so complete that even the archaeological evidence was initially misinterpreted or dismissed. Early archaeologists in Spain were looking for Roman remains or prehistoric cultures. They lacked the conceptual framework needed to recognize the distinctive material culture of an indigenous Iron Age civilization. The rediscovery of Tartessos thus required not just the accumulation of archaeological evidence, but also a fundamental shift in scholarly perspectives about the sophistication and autonomy of pre-Roman Iberian cultures. This shift was slow and contentious, with many scholars reluctant to abandon traditional views about the primitive nature of prehistoric European societies. Even today, the memory of Tartessos remains fragmented and incomplete. While scholars now accept that it was a real and significant ancient civilization, popular knowledge of Tartessian achievements remains limited. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs or Roman emperors, Tartessian kings have not captured the popular imagination in ways that would ensure their continued remembrance. The story of how Tartessos was forgotten thus becomes a meditation on the fragility of human memory and the complex processes by which some aspects of the past are preserved while others disappear. It reminds us that historical knowledge is not automatic or inevitable, but requires conscious effort and institutional support to maintain across generations. The forgetting of Tartessos was not the result of any single cause, but rather the cumulative effect of multiple factors that worked together to erase both the physical and cultural traces of this ancient civilization. Environmental changes buried its cities, political transformations destroyed its institutions, linguistic shifts eliminated its language, religious changes invalidated its cultural values, and geographical marginality reduced outside interest in its achievements. Yet the very completeness of this forgetting makes the rediscovery of Tartessos all the more remarkable. Against all odds, enough traces survived to allow modern scholars to piece together at least a partial picture of this lost civilization. The golden jewelry of Carambolo, the inscriptions scattered across the Spanish countryside, and the buried foundations detected by remote sensing technology all bear witness to human achievements that their creators never intended to hide, but that the passage of time conspired to conceal. The rediscovery of Tartessos thus represents not just an archaeological triumph, but a victory of human curiosity and persistence over the forces of forgetting. It reminds us that the past is never completely lost, that patient investigation can recover even the most thoroughly hidden traces of human achievement, and that every landscape holds stories waiting to be told if we learn how to listen to what the stones are trying to say. As twilight falls over the marshlands of Doñana, as the last light of day reflects off the quiet waters where the Guadalquivir meets the sea, we find ourselves at the end of a journey that has taken us through 3,000 years of mystery, discovery, and wonder. The story of Tartessos, which began with whispers in ancient Greek texts and led us through buried treasures, vanished cities, and forgotten scripts, finally brings us to a place of understanding that transforms how we see both the past and the present. Tartessos is no longer a myth. The accumulated weight of archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and scientific investigation has established beyond doubt that this was a real civilization, with real cities, real kings, and real achievements that deserve to stand alongside the great cultures of antiquity. The golden treasures gleaming in museum cases, the inscribed stones bearing Europe's earliest writing, and the buried foundations revealed by remote sensing technology all bear witness to a people who built something remarkable in the far west of the ancient world. Yet even as we celebrate this rediscovery, we must acknowledge how much remains unknown. The capital city that ancient sources described in such glowing terms still lies hidden beneath the protective embrace of Spanish wetlands. The language that Tartessian scribes used to record their thoughts and laws remains only partially understood, its grammar and vocabulary yielding their secrets slowly to patient scholars. The religious beliefs that motivated the construction of elaborate ceremonial complexes, the political systems that governed this far-flung civilization, and the daily lives of ordinary Tartessian people remain largely mysterious. This incompleteness is not a failure of modern scholarship, but a reminder of the fragility of human memory and the countless ways that time can erase even the most significant achievements. Every civilization faces the possibility of being forgotten, of having its monuments buried, its languages silenced, and its stories reduced to fragments that future generations must painstakingly reassemble. The rediscovery of Tartessos thus becomes more than just an archaeological success story. It becomes a meditation on resilience, both human and cultural. The Tartessians themselves showed remarkable resilience in creating a sophisticated civilization at the edge of the known world, adapting influences from across the Mediterranean to create something uniquely their own. When changing circumstances made their traditional way of life unsustainable, they showed further resilience in transforming their culture rather than simply abandoning it. The resilience of Tartessian memory is equally remarkable. Despite environmental burial, political disruption, linguistic transformation, and cultural change, enough traces survived to allow modern investigators to resurrect this lost world from scattered clues. The gold that glinted in a construction worker's shovel, the stones that bore mysterious inscriptions, and the geometric patterns visible only from space all carried forward the voices of people who lived and died thousands of years ago. This process of rediscovery continues today, driven by new technologies that can peer beneath the earth without disturbing the ecosystems that have grown over ancient ruins. Each satellite image that reveals geometric patterns in seemingly natural landscapes, each ground-penetrating radar survey that detects buried foundations, and each chemical analysis that reveals the composition of ancient metals adds another piece to the puzzle of Tartessian civilization, Perhaps most importantly, the story of Tartessos challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about the development of European civilization. For too long, the narrative of European history has been dominated by the achievements of Greece and Rome, with earlier cultures dismissed as primitive prehistory or marginal barbarian societies. The rediscovery of Tartessos reveals that sophisticated urban civilization emerged in Western Europe much earlier than traditionally supposed, and that it did so through indigenous development rather than simple imitation of Eastern Mediterranean models. This revision of European origins has implications that extend far beyond academic debates about ancient chronology. It suggests that the capacity for cultural innovation and political sophistication has been present throughout human history and across all regions of the world. The traditional narrative that portrays civilization as something that began in the East and gradually spread westward gives way to a more complex story of multiple centers of development, each adapting universal human capabilities to local conditions and opportunities. The Tartessians were not primitive Europeans waiting to be civilized by contact with more advanced Mediterranean cultures. They were active participants in the creation of European civilization, contributing their own innovations and insights to the broader human story. Their mastery of metallurgy, their development of distinctive artistic traditions, their creation of urban planning systems adapted to marshy environments, and their invention of one of Europe's earliest writing systems all represent genuine contributions to human cultural development. The hybrid nature of Tartessian civilization also offers lessons for our own interconnected world. The Tartessians succeeded not by rejecting foreign influences, but by creatively adapting them to serve local needs and preferences. They learned metalworking techniques from Phoenician craftsmen but used them to create distinctively Tartessian objects. They adopted alphabetic writing principles but modified them to record their own language. They incorporated Mediterranean architectural elements but arranged them according to their own aesthetic and practical requirements. This pattern of creative adaptation may be more relevant today than ever before, as globalization brings different cultures into increasingly close contact. The Tartessian example suggests that successful cultural exchange requires not the wholesale adoption of foreign models, but the creative synthesis of external influences with local traditions and values. The environmental dimensions of the Tartessian story also speak to contemporary concerns about sustainability and climate change. The Tartessians built their civilization in harmony with their marshy environment, developing technologies and settlement patterns that worked with natural processes rather than against them. When environmental changes made their traditional way of life unsustainable, they adapted rather than trying to fight the forces that were transforming their world. The sedimentation that buried Tartessian cities and the climate changes that altered their river systems remind us that human societies have always had to cope with environmental change. The difference between success and failure often lies not in the ability to prevent change, but in the wisdom to adapt to it constructively. The preservation of Tartessian remains beneath the protected wetlands of Doñana National Park creates a unique situation where archaeological investigation must be balanced against environmental conservation. This tension between the desire to uncover the past and the need to protect natural heritage for the future reflects broader challenges that our society faces in managing competing demands on limited resources. The fact that some of the most promising Tartessian sites may remain forever unexcavated in order to preserve the ecosystems that have grown over them represents a kind of temporal justice. The same natural processes that hid these ancient cities from view have created new forms of beauty and biological diversity that deserve protection in their own right. The flamingos that wade through Doñana's wetlands and the horses that gallop across its dunes are as much a part of this landscape's heritage as the golden jewelry and inscribed stones that lie buried beneath their feet. Yet this enforced patience may ultimately serve the cause of historical knowledge as well as environmental protection. The techniques available for archaeological investigation continue to improve with each passing year. The remote sensing technologies that can already detect buried structures without disturbing overlying sediments will undoubtedly become more sophisticated and informative. The day may come when we can explore ancient cities in minute detail without ever touching a shovel to soil. The interdisciplinary nature of Tartessian research which combines archaeology with geology, environmental science, linguistics, and computer technology, exemplifies the kind of collaborative approach that will be needed to address the complex challenges of the 21st century. No single academic discipline or methodological approach could have achieved the rediscovery of Tartessos. Success required the integration of multiple forms of expertise and the development of new techniques that could bridge traditional disciplinary boundaries. The story of Tartessos thus becomes a story about the power of human curiosity and collaboration to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The civilization that seemed lost forever has been partially recovered through the patient work of scholars who refused to accept that some mysteries could never be solved. Their example encourages us to believe that other lost chapters of human history may yet be recovered, that other voices from the past may yet find ways to speak to the present. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of Tartessian civilization is not any specific technological innovation or cultural achievement, but the simple demonstration that human beings have always been capable of creating beauty, meaning, and sophisticated social organization, regardless of when or where they lived. The golden treasures of Carambolo, the mysterious inscriptions scattered across the Spanish countryside, and the carefully planned cities buried beneath Andalusian marshes all bear witness to the enduring human capacity for creativity and achievement. As we stand in imagination on the ancient shores of the Guadalquivir, watching Phoenician ships arrive with their cargoes of exotic goods and new ideas, we are reminded that we are part of the same human story that began when our species first learned to shape tools, create art, and dream of better worlds. The Tartessians who built their civilization at the edge of the ancient world were our ancestors, not just in a biological sense but in a cultural one, pioneers in the ongoing human experiment of creating meaning and beauty from the raw materials of existence. Their voices may be difficult to hear across the centuries, filtered through languages we barely understand and preserved in fragments that resist easy interpretation. But they are still speaking to us, still offering their testimony about what human beings can accomplish when they combine practical skill with creative vision, when they learn from others while remaining true to their own values, and when they build for the future even while living fully in the present. The sun sets now over the marshlands where Tartessian ships once anchored, painting the sky in shades of gold that would have seemed familiar to ancient eyes. In that timeless light, the boundary between past and present seems to dissolve, reminding us that we are all part of a continuous human story that stretches back through countless generations and forward into an unknowable future. The Tartessians have taken their place in that story, no longer lost but found, no longer forgotten but remembered, no longer myth but history,